I'm Chris Castile in the Washington Bureau of the Oklahoman. Wednesday marks the 100th day of President Barack Obama's administration. It's been a busy 100 days. I went to Capitol Hill this week to talk to members of Oklahoma's congressional delegation about their perceptions of this benchmark in the Obama presidency.
I think for most of us it's still too early to tell. 100 days is really not a long period of time. I will say this. The president does remain pretty unpopular in our state, but at the same time, I'm glad to see that he's challenging the country. He's going out and tackling some pretty big issues. A lot of these issues have not turned into legislation yet, whether it be health care or energy policy, and the verdict is really still out there. And so as these bills move through Congress, I think it'll be important to see whether or not he keeps this pace up. He's actually trying to do a lot at once, which is a very difficult task. I was glad to see that he got the health insurance through for children, that he is involved in, and it was involved in getting legislation signed for public service. But other than that, there are a lot of areas that we disagree on. I mean, frankly, Oklahoma is still a very conservative state, and so as we go forward, I would say that I'm going to challenge him when I think he's wrong, and when he's right, I'm going to support him, and that's kind of where our district is.
I think he's doing a lot of the things he said he would do that people didn't pay attention, and that's moving to a much enhanced federal government, larger federal government, a more intrusive federal government, one that will give us less liberty. He said those things, but I don't think people necessarily believed him. I think on foreign affairs he's worked hard to reach out in reconciliation. Sometimes we reject the way he's done that because there's an apology with it, but it's always a good principle for us to talk to people, and so I'm not critical of his foreign policy. I'm highly critical of his domestic policy and the fact that we're borrowing money we don't have to spend on things we absolutely don't need. We didn't pass a stimulus bill, we passed a socialism bill when we passed the Recovery Act.
Well, while I appreciate President Obama's enthusiasm for his new role as President of the United States, I also think that it is probably our nation's biggest moment in its history when we have seen so much more spending, more government programs, more debt, more borrowing than we've ever experienced. In fact, if you look at his first 100 days in office, you'll find that he has spent over $500 billion just in those first 100 days and taken us into debt. In fact, by the end of April, we have already spent all the revenue for the whole year for the United States by that time, and now we're into deficit spending for our nation. And we have certainly seen many changes in programming and policy for our nation, whether it's dealing with terrorism, whether it's dealing with pro-life type issues, or spending or taxing or energy policy, secret card check. There have been so many new policy changes that I believe are out of step with how the majority of Americans believe and even their values for America.
What I think is, I'm looking at him, he is mirroring what happened in 1993 with Bill Clinton, except you multiply by 10. He talks about the budget of $1.5 trillion, and Clinton had talked about a budget of $1.5 trillion, and this is 3.2, so it's double that. All of the figures are just much larger. The fact that he started out, if you give him some responsibility, which I do now because of Geithner's participation with the bailout, he's actually managed to spend about $2 trillion already this year.
It's been an amazing 100 days. If you look at what he's proposed budget-wise, what has gone through, some of the most dramatic increases in spending literally in the history of the country, whether it was the almost $800 billion stimulus bill, the $400 billion omnibus appropriation, or the budget proposal now that we will soon clear the final version of. I won't be voting for it, which projects a $3.5 trillion federal budget next year, even with a $1.4 trillion, and that's trillion with a T, dollars worth of tax increases, still a projected $9 trillion budget over the course of the next decade. That's taking us in his short tenure in office from an $11 trillion deficit, which took 230 years to develop, to a $20 trillion deficit shortly after he leaves. It's amazing. And if you look at what it does to agriculture, what the proposals do to energy, this is just amazing. Who would have guessed that this administration would be firing the chairman of General Motors, running the board of directors off, taking control of the company? Who would have guessed we'd control this much of America's financial institutions now? So, first 100 days, I suppose the president gets an A for style, but when it comes to policy, that's frighteningly close to a C or D, and if you look at how he has worked to rein in the leadership of his majority in Congress, that's probably an F.